Okay, one of the first questions we ask is your name, where you were born, and the date you were born.
Well, my name is Anthony C. Romeo. I was born in Denver, February 23rd, 1922.
You wound up in the military. How did that happen?
Well, I was in college as a music student when World War II broke out. So on December the 7th, when the war broke out, I was taking final examinations at Greeley. I was in school there. And then, of course, like all of the young men of those days, my roommate and I decided the first thing we were going to do when we finished the exam was get back to Denver and enlist. So then the question became, where? And my roommate, being much smarter than I was, said, well, why don't we start at the top and work our way down? And I said, because a violin player, I didn't know how in the world I was going to be able to serve. So we came down to Denver, and on the 21st of December, which was the last day of school, we came down to Denver and went to the Navy recruiting, which was in the basement of the old Customs House for Naval Air Corps. And they turned my roommate down, very smart guy, but he had flat feet and weak eyes. And I had perfect eyes and good feet, and so they accepted me. So I signed up officially with the Navy Air Corps in December 21st of 1941. But I didn't get to go into training just yet because the requirement was you had to have 2 years of college and be 20 years old. And I was 19 and in my second year, so they waived me until the next summer. So I actually started my career in the Navy in the summer of 1942.
What kind of training did they put you into right away?
Well, because I was a backup by that time, instead of going right into pre-flight school, which was the normal way, they sent me, first of all, believe it or not, to a little ghost town in Northern California, about 40 miles north of Lake Tahoe. It's on a highway going down into Reno. It was a town of Beckworth. And I spent 30 days there, and this was in the winter, 30 days there flying Aeronca Champs, little 65 horsepower airplanes with skis. And so for the first, about 2 or 3 weeks, we were on skis, and then finally the snow melted and they took the skis off. And then it was like looking like a bunch of jackrabbits out there trying to land those airplanes. Because with skis, of course, the airplane, you come in and land and it just plops. It doesn't do that on wheels. But in any event, I had my, about a month or maybe a little more there. And then they sent me home again and said, well, we still don't have room for you. So they sent me out to Sterling, Colorado. And I had another month of flying out there in little 65 horsepower airplanes. Then when I got done with that, they did send me to pre-flight school in Del Monte, California. I got a base there, which was where the language school is. And it was a luxury, just a very luxurious place to be. That was where Bing Crosby and Bob Hope used to play golf all the time, and the Navy commandeered it, of course, and there we were in this luxury hotel in the first stages of our flying. And then from there, of course, I went to Pasco, Washington, where I did my acrobatic training, and then from there down to Corpus Christi. And I finished all of my training at Corpus Christi, Texas.
What'd you do after all that? Where were you headed?
Well, then in the process of going through training, I ended up in twin engine. I'd always wanted to be a fighter pilot, and the Navy was coming out with a new twin engine fighter, and so I was going to be prepared for that. And of course, then they scrapped the fighter because it was too hot to land on a carrier, so I ended up in bombers instead. So my first assignment was in an attack bomber, the old Ventura, which is the same airplane, military version of the airplane that Amelia Earhart used for her trip. So I was flying that airplane, and along about 19, in the middle of 44, I guess it was, had formed into a crew and was on my way to the Philippine Islands to join a squadron there as a replacement crew. And then when I got as far as Hawaii, they said that whole squadron had been so badly shot up, they relieved them. And they said, we can't use you now, so we can either send you back and you'll have to reform into another squadron, or if you're willing, we'll check you out in the four-engine bombers. At that time, the Navy had just acquired a new four-engine bomber, which was the Navy version of the B-24. It was a big airplane called a privateer. It had a big single tail on it instead of the little tails that the B-24 had. And I said, great. So I checked out there at Kaneohe, and after I got checked out there, I did some training flights and stuff in the airplane. And then I did go out to the Philippine Islands as a replacement crew for Squadron VPB 119. And so I flew then the last year of the war. I was based there in Clarkfield, and we flew missions all over the South China Sea in that area, everywhere from what is was Indonesia in those days, or Indochina, anywhere from Hainan Island clear up to the southern tip of Japan. So we flew all through that area.
What kind of flying was, what kind of targets were you after?
Well, see, we were flying a B-24, and everybody thinks of B-24s as flying at high altitude and big formations and dropping huge amounts of bombs. Well, we were doing exactly the opposite. When the Navy took that airplane, they removed the ball turret underneath it because we were always going to be so low. So while they flew high, we flew low. While they dropped bombs en masse, we only had a small bomb supply because we had to carry so much fuel to go the distances we did. So we were very careful about how we dropped those bombs, which means we did everything at masthead level. The pilots actually dropped the bombs, so we didn't have bombardiers. So we had a button on the yoke, and we'd come in, and at the right time we'd hit the button and drop the bomb. And that way we didn't waste very many bombs. We flew, as I was saying, in the completely opposite from the way they were being flown in Europe. And on our missions, as we would approach the enemy territory, we would start to drop down to low altitude so they couldn't pick us up on radar. So most all of our combat flying was done from 200 feet. And we would fly over the ocean. We were looking for small ships. We were always by ourselves, never in formations, always by ourselves. And so one bomber lumbering along at 200 miles an hour is not going to sink a battleship. We did have a few guys that tried it, and they didn't make it. But most of us, our real mission was to go out and try to sink any small shipping, or go into ports and that sort of thing and try to find railroads or radar stations, anything we could find that we thought was worthy of dropping our bombs. That's what we did. So we would do that.
When you're coming in that low, when you drop those bombs, you better keep right going, hadn't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's the reason they called it masthead bombing. As a matter of fact, with some ships, the masts were a bit high enough that you'd come in to drop the bombs, and we learned various techniques. We knew how to skip bombs and do all that kind of stuff. And there were times when we would come in low and have to pull up in order to get over the ship and not run into their mast. But that was pretty much standard technique for us in the Navy. Well, there was only a small group of us really doing this. And the airplane that we flew, the privateer, I think the reason nobody ever knows about it is it was so brand new. It was a new model that had just come out. And I think only about 700 of them were produced because the war had ended by then. So we were flying this brand new technology airplane that was really it was a nice airplane. It was a nice airplane. Of course, it was a bomber. It was slow, but the way we flew it, it was fun. It really was.
What kind of resistance were you finding?
Well, we always tried to surprise them, so we could avoid the too much direct contact. But when we did, usually what we were doing, we were always thinking about this. For instance, Hong Kong Harbor was probably the most dangerous place for us, and not a one of us would ever try to fly into the harbor. So what we would do is when we had that particular sector to fly, we'd either go maybe 50 or 100 miles to the south or the north and fly inland and go in a ways and then come around and then come back and hit the harbor going out and go through as fast as we could and hope we didn't get taken down. And if we could get out of the harbor, we were also headed home. We were headed east. And we just go as fast as we could because we knew the fighters would be coming after us. But the Japanese fighters didn't have a long range. So if we could fight them off for half an hour, then we were okay, because they'd have to turn back. And that's the way we handled that.
How fast could you go in relation to the fighters?
Well, if you, actually in level flight, about the most that we could do was about 210 or 20 miles an hour, so we were much slower, but we had great armament. When the Navy took that airplane over, as I said, they took the ball turret off the belly of the airplane. That's where we had our radar, and then they put in extra turrets up above, so we had 6 power turrets on that airplane, all throwing out twin 50s. We had 1 on the nose, 2 on the top, 1 on the tail, and 2 on each side, or 1 on each side, so a total of 6. And so when the fighters come after us, we could jink around and force them to always to come in at an angle where we could roll ourselves up on a wing and put about 4 turrets on them at the same time. And it's surprising how often they broke off. Anyway, there were a lot of tracer bullets coming at them from 8 guns. So that was our major tactic. But the real tactic was to get as far away as fast as possible.
Did you guys shoot down many Japanese planes?
Well, our particular crew, we thought probable. We were attacked by fighters, and we had one that there was a little smoke coming out of it as we continued on out, but we didn't see them go in, so who knows. But we didn't shoot down a lot of fighters because that wasn't our mission at all, and what we did mainly was sink ships and that sort of thing, and then try to avoid the fighters as much as possible.
You talked about flying into Hong Kong being one of the trickiest places. What were some of the areas that you flew over, and did you have to attack ground installations much more than?
Well, Hong Kong was the worst, and that's where we came the closest to getting it ourselves individually. We got out of there, but we were pretty well shot up, and we had one of our crew members wounded, but we were able to get home, so we're lucky. And to go back to your question about hot spots, well, we had, from where we left when we left the Philippine Islands, we had the entire coast of China, clear up from the southern tip of Japan all the way down to Hainan Island, which is down off Vietnam, divided into 200-mile sectors. It was just like pie shapes. And then those were sectors 1 through 10. And then you knew which sector you were going to have next. And if it happened to be Hong Kong, you thought, oh boy. And there were other sectors where it was relatively quiet. But there were some, Hong Kong and Swatow, Formosa was another hot spot. They had a lot of Japanese bases there. That's where we ran into more fighters than we did along the China coast. But Hainan Island was also sort of a tough spot. But there was up and down. Some places were worse than others.
Did you have any contingency plans if you got shot up going into one of these places? Could you fly into China, bail out, and try to meet up with the underground there?
Well, one of the first, very early in our tour of duty out there, we had a crew shot down, and they landed in a field, and the whole story is really more than I can tell you now, but they landed in a field, and it was one of the questions is if they got out on the right side of the airplane, the Chinese would find them and they'd be safe. If they got on the wrong side, which they didn't know, then the Japanese would get them. And so they got out of the airplane and ran as fast as they could, and they were picked up by the Chinese. And about, it had to have been almost 2 months later, here they came back. The Chinese had picked them up, and they had, they kept them secure at night in their villages, and then they would move them on foot, and they moved all the way back to Chongqing, which was the American base inland, I think where the Flying Tigers flew out of and that all. And that was their destination. Once they got them to Chongqing, then they could fly them back out. So we had one crew that we know that went down. It was helped by the Chinese. They were our very dear allies at that time. But mostly, if we really got shot down or had any kind of severe engine troubles or anything, why, just a lot of water out there, and so there were a number of crews we lost that we just don't know whatever happened to them.
You had rafts and things that you could get out if you could come down all right on the plane? Or were you
No,
just kinda-
not rafts, no.
Nothing to.
No, we had May Wests, life vests. And a little later on, that was the one thing that always worried me more than anything else was I somehow being a Denver boy that didn't know how to swim until he got into the Navy, the ocean wasn't my favorite place. And I just never really wanted to be shark bait. And then finally, about the halfway through our tour, they came out with shark repellent that we had as part of our kit. So theoretically, if we got shot down and we managed to survive, we could put this shark repellent out. It would not only supposed to keep the sharks away, but would color the sea around us so they could find us and come get us. But never had to find out if it worked.
This may sound like a dumb question to somebody who doesn't know all the details about the weapons of that period, but why, if you're going in low level like that, why were you dropping bombs and not using torpedoes?
Well, because we weren't equipped to drop torpedoes. It takes a special airplane, and all the torpedo bombers that the Navy had were single-engine airplanes, and they would carry a torpedo in a bomb bay and come down to low altitude. With us, first of all, we only had one bomb rack, so we were limited. The airplane originally came equipped with 4 bomb racks, but in order to fly, we would fly missions as long as 14 hours. And in order to stay out that long, you couldn't carry enough fuel in the regular tanks. So on 3 of those bomb racks, they put in rubber-lined gas tanks. Each one carried 450 gallons of fuel. And then we had this Rube Goldberg transfer system to get the fuel to the engines, and that gave us our range. So we only had one rack where we could carry the bombs. And then before we would leave, we knew the night before what mission we would have the next day. So we would determine from that whether we wanted to have one 500-pound bomb. You could put a 500-pound bomb in that rack, or you could put 2 250s or 5 100-pound bombs. So we would determine on what kind of targets we thought we'd have, what combination we wanted, and they would load them there at Clark Field. And then, being young and who knows what, we decided, well, it doesn't make sense to go out all day long and only be able to drop maybe one bomb. So as you might have seen when you look at the B-17 here and you see the inside, there's empty extra space back there, and we'd usually get anywhere as many as 20 100-pound bombs, which 2 guys can handle, and we'd just throw those in the back loose. So then when we get out there and drop the first bombs, and we'd pull on out, and quickly our guys would get out of their turrets and then rush back and they'd load up 5 100-pounders, and we'd go drop those, and we'd keep doing this over till we used up our whole supply.
But just loose.
Well, yeah, just throw them in the back.
Gosh.
We realized we were in our 20s. I wouldn't do that now. Yeah.
Oh, that had to be awfully lonely going out like that, just one plane?
Well, there were 10 of us, but we all had different sectors, so we'd all leave at pretty much within an hour of each other in the morning, and so we always knew the other guys were out there. And I don't know, you didn't feel like you were really alone, even though, we really were, and we were operating it as a crew. And there are a lot of advantages to fighting the war that way, because when you go out in a whole fleet of airplanes, you all have to hold in formation, and if you get attacked, you all sit there and hope you don't get hit. Well, we didn't have anything like that. We were on our own, and it was up to us. We protected ourselves. We picked our own targets, and it gave us a amount of freedom that was very essential to the job we were doing.
Had to be tremendous psychologically against the enemy, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, I think it was, because they never knew when we were coming or from where, and even though we didn't have a huge wallop, we couldn't drop thousands of pounds of bombs. If we could plant the bomb we wanted where we wanted, it was damage. So that's the way we operated.
How did you learn to do those kind of bombing techniques, bombing at low level and not having bombardiers or bomb sites like that?
Well, we'd sit around in the evenings and talk about it, and we'd all discuss it, and like everything else, it sort of evolved. It wasn't, we'd never had training in it, but it also made sense. I mean, if you get out in an airplane and you're flying along over the ground and you want to drop something on a particular target, it doesn't take you long to figure out what the arc of the bomb is as it leaves the airplane and how soon before you get that you needed to push the button. And you do that a couple times and you can see the results, and then you make whatever corrections you have to make. But you don't have to make too many corrections when you're down that low, because you don't have wind factors or any of that kind of stuff. Well, you get in on that target and you can really plant your bomb.
Was there a bomb sight, or was it just kind of line of
Oh,
sight?
no. We just looked out the front of the airplane, and we had no bombardier. We just had 2 buttons. One button we'd push to open the bomb bays when we started our run, and then as we came in on the target, then one other button, just like a radio button. You get down to the right spot, click it, and out go the bombs.
Who was the naval officer that figured out that this was something to do?
I haven't any idea. It was probably Bull Halsey, because he had been a Navy pilot, and I think he was always he's always a carrier commander and stuff, and I think most of the really tactical things that came out of the Navy, he probably had a good deal to do with that. But a lot of this stuff was just stuff that we picked up as we went along. We learned by our mistakes or by our experience, and we could just pass that information around from pilot to pilot.
Did many people know that you were doing this?
No. No, it wasn't good Hollywood stuff. Hollywood, my airplane, when I mention what my airplane was, people look at me with sort of a blank stare when I say the Navy privateer. They don't have any idea what it was. And I say, well, it was a converted B-24, and then when I explain all the changes that were made, they still don't get it. Actually, when they get it the most is when I say, you've heard of slurry bombers, haven't you? And I said, at the end of the war, that because that airplane was so much more efficient, really, than the B-17 in the amount of capacity it could carry, speed, the way the airplane was designed, they were the ones that were picked up by the Forestry Service and all to use as slurry bombers. And of course, they took all the turrets and stuff off, but they could carry a large capacity of retardant, and those are the ones. As a matter of fact, it was they were flying until just about 5 or 6 years ago, when right up here I think it was northwest of Denver, they were fighting a fire one day, and a wing came off. Well, the airplanes were over 60 years old, and what they were being put through was pretty rough on an airplane, so I guess they finally decided that was it.
You never ran across any higher atolls or islands that you didn't know were there, or
well,
flying low?
There were a lot of low stuff there. Well, actually, the one atoll that we flew out of for a whole month, I was in Johnson Island, and it's still it's an island that's used as an emergency field, I think, these days. But Johnson Island is about 550 miles, roughly, I think, southwest of Hawaii. And in those days, it's just this little atoll. It's about 5,000 feet in diameter, and which was just long enough for us to be able to land and get off. And it had a V-shaped airport. The one leg of the V was the runways, and the other V was a place to park the aircraft. So, and in between, they had all the barracks that were, and we lived there. And I was there for about a month on search duty when General Harmon was shot down somewhere southwest of there, and we went out searching for him for a whole month. Never did find him. We used to fly through the typhoons out in the Pacific in order to track them so they could send that information onto the fleet. I always consider that flight going out hunting the typhoons to be much more dangerous than going over the coast, but that's what we had to do.
You talked about flying into a typhoon. Did you go all the way into the eye of the typhoon?
Oh, yes. See, what precipitated all of that is when we first got out there, for those who are history buffs, might remember that sometime fairly early in the war, the cruiser Pittsburgh. Now, the cruiser is a pretty big ship, and the cruiser Pittsburgh got caught in a typhoon out there, and it tore the bow off. And they managed to keep it from sinking. They got onto it and towed it before it went down and managed to get it back in port. And then they suddenly realized that, you know, we didn't have a satellite system or anything else. They needed to know when these typhoons were coming along. And of course, a typhoon is nothing but a hurricane. They just call them typhoon on that side of the world. And so they said, we have got to start tracking these things. And so that became our job. And the way we'd do it is they'd have an airplane go out, and you never had any trouble finding the eye of a typhoon because the wind's always going counterclockwise at a very high speed, and you simply fly crosswind into them, and you can fly right into the eye. And what we would do is the first airplane would fly into the eye, and we usually flew it at about 3,000 feet. We wanted to be high enough that the waves are so high that if we got in any rough area, we wanted to be sure we didn't get sucked down into the sea. But on the other hand, we couldn't go much higher because it was you couldn't see the sea then. You couldn't. We navigated by looking at the water, and so we could tell by the size of the waves and the direction, which the direction of the wind was. And in those days, when you don't have any radio in for navigation, you use the wind drift and your speed. And those are the factors for your navigation. So we would fly into the center of the eye and continue on out the other side and fly for maybe a couple hours and then turn around and come back through. And all the time, there were three of us as pilots, and two would be flying the airplane and the third would be doing the navigating, and we'd switch in and out. And so whoever was navigating would keep navigating. And then when we came back through on our chart, it would show that where we were at, say at 12 o'clock, we were in this position of the eye, and then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the eye was in a different position. And so you could look at what the positions were, and from that you could determine not only the direction it was going, but the speed it was moving. And then by the time we're headed home, another airplane is on its way, and it picks it up, and it does the same thing. So you have this series of little run lines that show the direction and the speed of the typhoon, and from that they could project, well, I think with some pretty good accuracy, where the storms were going to hit so the fleet could get out of the way if they had to.
How rough was it going in through the typhoon?
I think that probably we lost more airplanes on that kind of duty than we did directly to the Japanese. It was very rough. And of course, with that Rube Goldberg fuel system we had, we were always worried because you almost always smelled fumes in the airplane. And we had a standing rule. Of course, we didn't have radio equipment. We didn't use it. And it was a standard rule. Nobody ever even considered striking a match, lighting a cigarette, or anything like that. So we just tried to keep it as calm as possible, but it was it was quite rough.
The eye, how much, I know they probably varied, but how long would you fly through the eye of this thing?
Not very long. They're not very big. It's too long ago for me to really remember, but it was a matter of minutes.
I just remember that when it would come over, I was in Okinawa, when it would come over, it was the eeriest feeling because it was just quiet.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a green mist look to it.
And if you were right where the eye was, all of a sudden you could see the sun if you look straight up, and it very calm for a short period of time, and then when the other side hits you, there you go again. Oh yes. One of the other things that was unique about what we were doing and what was our favorite missions were we were called upon from time to time to supply the G8, which was a Navy intelligence units that were behind the Japanese lines in the along all areas of China, and they needed to be supplied from time to time. So every now and then we'd get a mission, and we'd get a couple of great big duffel bags full of stuff that they needed, plus some beer, of course, and they would put several of them in the back of the airplane, and they had a rendezvous points assigned, And we would know that, for instance, right outside of the city of, I remember we went just outside of Swatow, which is a pretty big Japanese base, but these guys were outside and they gave us the coordinates of where they were going to be. And what they would do is in the night before we were to arrive, they'd go out and chalk out a big X on a field, and that was X marks the spot, and that's where we were supposed to make our drop. So they would be hiding in the trees, and we would come in at exactly 200 feet, because the parachutes that these duffel bags were dropped out of would open in 180 feet, and you wanted to break the fall of the bags, but you didn't want them to go floating down for 2 or 3 minutes, because then they would be found out. So we were out on this run that particular day, and had everything all set, and just before we were going to make our run, I was doing the navigating at the time, and so the guy said, "Why don't you go back and make sure everything's set?" So I went back there, and they had everything set, and here was the youngest member on our crew. He couldn't have been over 17, this really good-looking little sailor who was really, thought he was the world's greatest ladies' man. And he'd heard about this crew of ours that had been shot down over China and how wonderfully they'd been treated on all their trip across China, and he wanted to get out of that airplane, and he was standing right there at the edge of the bomb bay, and the doors are open, he's got his parachute on, and he's ready to roll out. And so I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Lee, do you know what altitude we're at right now?" And he looked at me, I said, 200 feet. And he turned absolutely as white as a sheet, and he got the picture, and that was it. But he would have gone out.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, gee.
Might have been a ladies' man, but maybe not a brain surgeon.
No.
So you sure he didn't become Tony Curtis later on?
He looked, he looked a little bit like him, as a matter of fact, yeah. He was a really good-looking young man, and he was really a ladies' man, and he thought this was going to be his dream trip.
Did you ever check his IQ after that?
He was a smart kid.
He was just all caught up.
Yeah, he had a hormonal imbalance, I guess.
Oh my.
But there were a lot of things like that were pretty funny.
Had a pretty tight-knit crew.
Oh yes, yeah. There were 12 of us on our airplanes. I think the Boeing, the B-17, I think, had 10 or 11, I'm not sure, but we had 12. We had more guns, and so we needed an extra number of crew.
Did all the guys come through with you?
Yeah, our crew came through. As I said, we had one. As a matter of fact, it was the young man I'm talking about on that trip through the Hong Kong harbor. It couldn't happen to a better guy because he got the Purple Heart, and so that made his life, I'm sure.
You had something you could impress the girls with.
Yeah. So I flew 48 missions with a total of 600 and probably 650 hours of flying time there. And I was there when the war ended, and being very young, one of the younger crew members, I didn't get home until several months later because of the system they had for getting us all home. Husbands first and that sort of thing.
You were kind of fortunate, at least, that they were doing this towards the end of the war when the Japanese Air Force and Navy was not quite so powerful. Was this something that they wouldn't have tried if they hadn't already been beaten down quite a bit at that point?
You mean what we were doing?
Yeah, going up by yourself and.
Oh no, we were doing that the whole time. Yeah, no, the war in the Pacific was it just wasn't reported the way the war in Europe was, and it never has been. It's not a real Hollywood story. D-Day is one of the biggest days in the history of the United States, and most people don't realize that we had one D-Day after another in the Pacific. Every one of those island landings were brutal. but people don't know that. And they didn't know much about our flying over there because most of the flying was really reported from the Air Force standpoint, and by the time the war in Europe was done and the Air Force arrived over at Clark Field, they were flying B-29s and B-50s, and they were always up at high altitude dropping bombs, and you know, how much can you show other than a fleet of airplanes and the bombs dropping off, and in the meantime we were down there just off the deck, and believe me, I'm really pleased. I just felt that we had the best possible flying there was to have. I really do.
I think a lot of people, you talk about the fact that your part of the war wasn't reported very much, because I think most people, when they think of naval aviation from that time, they think about carrier battles and fighters, and
right,
dive bombers, torpedo bombers,
right,
or anything like that. So yours was a totally different experience from what they had.
Right, completely different.
Any kind of a rivalry with those guys? Did you ever run across them, or?
Well, not within the Navy guys themselves. We were all together, but we certainly had our rivalries with the Army Air Force. But that was all very good-natured.
It's like when we get the B-17 and B-24 guys together.
That's right, right. Those of us that flew the B-24 models knew which were the better airplanes.
Oh, we're going to introduce you to
Yes, we do a thing with Regis University. They have a class where they bring a lot of vets in, and we've had B-17 and 24 guys go at it in front of the group,
Yeah.
talking about which plane was better.
Yeah.
Have you talked with other B-24 veterans, people who are on the more conventional planes, about what your experience was like compared to what they did?
Oh yes, I'm a volunteer out at the Wings Museum, and so we have men that fly. And as a matter of fact, I had a brother-in-law too who was a gunner in B-17s in Europe, and he was small enough that he had the great privilege of being a ball turret gunner, and his stories were enough. It chilled my blood. I decided that there was no way that I would ever want to have done what he did.
You just got to fly in the B-17, didn't you? Explain what that was like.
Well, I figured out that it's been 64 years since I was in the privateers that I flew, and I hadn't been in one since then. And when I climbed on board that thing, I thought, oh my gosh, so much of it looked familiar, really, because as I was telling you a little earlier, there's only so much you can do with a tube, and they were both big tubes with bomb bays and guns and all that sort of stuff, and it really brought back old memories that had really faded.
Are there reunions with guys that you flew with?
We did have for a period of time. There was a young man whose father had been a privateer pilot during World War II that had an association. He was based in California, and for a long time, once a year, we had what he called the all-squadron meeting. We had all-squadron meetings because our squadrons were so small. We only had 15 crews in a squadron, so trying to get that many guys together over all this period of time didn't work. But he had an all-squadron reunion at different places. We had one at Colorado Springs here not too many years ago. Been back to Detroit, not to California, and various places. And once a year we'd get together, and those were all of the various patrol squadrons like ours, the ones that not only flew the privateer, but also the Navy had some that were just converted B-24s. So we all got together and would compare notes, and it was pretty interesting every now and then to run into one of my old crew members that I hadn't seen for 40 or 50 years. So. But that's not, to my knowledge, that's not going on anymore. I think too many guys are gone anymore. Not many of us left.
Are there any of the privateers still left, museums or anywhere?
To my knowledge, there's maybe one, possibly two. I really need to get on the line and see if I can find out if there's any of them that are really restored. When we went to one of the reunions that I mentioned in Detroit, they had one there, but it had been used as as a cargo plane for a long time, and they were just beginning to restore it to its original military status. But all it was really the fuselage, and all the turrets were gone and stuff, so it really didn't look like the airplane that I flew. But I'm hoping that maybe they finally restored it. The nice thing about flying the war as a pilot, you know, it was either you made it or you didn't. But I could never have, I don't think I ever could have faced having to try to stick a bayonet in somebody or that sort of thing. I couldn't take that. But I could take the idea that we would go out there and we would use what skills we had against what skills the other guy had, and whoever won went home, and who didn't ended up in the drink. And I could take that, and it never really bothered me. And we lost a number of crews, but and I'm not a historian, but my guess is that there were probably as many pilots that lost their lives as infantry. But it was a different way of fighting the war.
Is there any kind of a special message that you'd like to get across on this? Because, again, this is something we haven't heard about, people don't know about. It'd be nice for some of the American people to be able to see what actually happened, wouldn't it?
Well, I think I've pretty much told you most of what I think I could say about it. Is just that we are only one factor in the war that was virtually unknown to the media. I know there are lots of others. There are some reports about commandos and stuff, but about the individual raids, some of the things that were going on were really unique, and there just wasn't any way for them to really report them. And so there are a lot of things that people don't know about what went on during that war.